panelists and not of the University of Southern California's, who are strictly neutral in this election, but as political scientists, we'll be asking people to use their slightly different perspective on this election to tell us what they think, independently of what their institution or USC itself might think about anything. So without further ado, you haven't joined here to listen to me, you've joined to listen to our esteemed panel. So I'd like to start by welcoming our moderator for this evening. Allyson Stewart-Allen's a renowned author, speaker, and educator, and she's an expert in brand internationalization. And we can discuss what the United States' brand has been like for the last 4 years and perhaps going forward. She's a graduate of USC's Marshall School of Business and is the CEO of International Marketing Partners. She's a Los Angeles native, but she's been in London for 31 years, so hopefully she's lost her accent and has a neutral accent like mine. She's advised over 240 businesses across 26 countries, including some well-known names, including our very own BBC, Burberry, HSBC, and others, specifically around how they can profitably build their international leadership and reach. She's also written a best-selling book, Working with Americans, which, as the panelists will tell you, I found extremely difficult. And its second edition was published in late November 2019. She's often on TV and print, and we're very grateful to have her today to moderate our panel. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Allyson. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for being here today, this evening. I think for most of you dialing in, you're this side of the Atlantic, the European side. Well, I'm delighted to have this incredible brains trust around me this evening also. And let me go ahead and introduce you to the other panelists. So one of our panelists this evening is Dave Bridge. Dave is joining us via a pre-recorded video. Unfortunately, he's had another commitment that's meant that he couldn't be here in person, but you'll hear more from him momentarily. So Dave's a USC graduate, a three-time graduate as it happens, in 2004, 07, and 2010. He's an associate professor of poli-sci at Baylor, where he teaches courses on the US Constitution and campaigns and elections. His research focuses on the Supreme Court and its effect on coalition building, especially by major political parties. He contributes to the scholarship of teaching and learning and has published a handful of articles showing how professors can use games in the classroom that enhance the students' learnings of politics. He's a Los Angelino native by birth, like myself, and now lives in Waco, Texas, home of one of the first ever In-N-Out burgers in the Lone Star State. Our second panelist this evening is Parker Hevron, who's an associate professor of poli-sci at Texas Women's University in Denton, a suburb of Dallas. He earned his PhD in political science in 2013 from USC and has a BA in political science and history from Austin College. He teaches classes on American and Texas politics. I like the fact that you distinguish between the two, Parker, as well as classes on law, politics, and public policy. His research is at the intersection of mass media and the courts. His latest research project with Jeb Barnes from USC has been funded by the National Science Foundation and explores the media coverage of the American tort system and its impacts on people's attitudes towards the law. He lives in Dallas with his wife and his 2 young sons. We're also joined this evening by Justin Berry. Justin is an associate professor of political science at Kalamazoo College in Kalamazoo, Michigan, earned his PhD in political science in 2014 from USC, an MA in teaching from Loyola Marymount University, and a BA in political science from Villanova. He teaches classes on American politics, political behavior, race and ethnicity, and law. His research focuses on the political behavior of racial and pan-ethnic groups in America and how social identity influences that behavior. His most recent article examines the influence of perceived group discrimination on vote choice in the 2012 and 2016 presidential elections. He lives in Kalamazoo with his girlfriend Christine and her son Min. And last but not least is Youssef Chouhoud, an assistant professor of political science affiliated with the Reef Center for Human Rights and Conflict Resolution at Christoper Newport University. His research elaborates the determinants of support for core democratic norms by examining understudied groups and contexts. Dr. Chouhoud, his current project on political tolerance draws on original surveys, experimental data, and elite interviews in North Africa and the United States. Prior to joining CNU, Dr. Chouhoud was a Provost's Fellow at USC, where he got his PhD. As a President's Scholar, he earned his MA in Political Science at Lehigh University, where he also got his BA in History. So as you can see, we have quite an illustrious group of experts assembled this evening to look at this topic, as we called it, Trump versus Biden to November and beyond. And really, you might be wondering, well, you know, why are we here? What are we going to be talking about, given the most contentious, most maybe covered and most invested presidential race in living memory, certainly in the last 100 years. And I think what we're all hoping in the course of our discussion and with your questions is to try to uncover, what does this all mean for the United States? What does it mean for relations that the US has around the globe internationally? What is the possible outcome from next Tuesday's race? And what might those implications be for the United States and for its allies, and maybe its enemies, depending on whether it's a Trump or a Biden White House. So really, the goal is to see, you know, what we're looking for from this election, and what's the direction of travel, in the opinion of our esteemed guests. So let me maybe just share a couple of ideas, if I may, from my own perspective on this. I'm not a political scientist by training or background, but as you heard, I'm a business consultant. And living here in London from Los Angeles originally for the last 32 years, I can certainly say that I'm interested in this topic, maybe somewhat selfishly, because the country brand of the United States over the course of this time of 30 plus years has changed radically. Over the last 4 years, not surprisingly, it has been eroded. Trust has eroded. Our reputation is worse in the UK and Europe. If you read the Pew research, which comes out pretty much every September, early October, their latest study tracks citizenry around the globe and their opinions of different countries, and the US has shown a significant decline versus pre-2016. It may not surprise you. Most of you are here in Europe and the UK, so you'll be aware of this challenge. And so my hope is that as we discuss this tonight with Justin, Parker, and Youssef, that perhaps we might even get some glimmers of light by the end of our evening together that shows that perhaps there is a way to restore America's former standing, to perhaps restore its influence, certainly diplomatic influence, if not economic. And I know that my panelists will have views on Brand USA alongside their own areas of specialism. So I think maybe at this point, it's best we start by hearing from our absent friend, our absent panelist, Dave Bridge, and his pre-recorded observations and analyses. So perhaps, James, if you're happy to let us hear what he has to say.
System, the Electoral College. So just a really quick briefer on how we elect presidents. There's really just two things you need to know. One is that the magic number is 270. So a candidate has to get 270 electoral votes in order to win. And the other thing that you have to know is that most states use a winner-take-all system. So if you get the most popular votes within a state, you win all of the electoral votes. So for example, California has 55 electoral votes. We could imagine maybe 10 million and one Californians showing up to vote. And if 5 million and one vote for Joe Biden and 5 million vote for Donald Trump, then Joe Biden gets all 55 electoral votes. They don't split them proportionally. It's not like Trump gets 27 of the 55 and Biden gets 28 of the 55. They all go to the person who got the most popular votes. So 270, winner take all. Those are really the only two things you need to know about how we elect presidents. I want to show you kind of how the electoral map looks today and where we're headed here in the next week or so. So you should see a map here of the United States. Some states are colored red, some states are colored blue. This is coming from 270towin.com, where you can click on different states, turn them red and blue, and find out what kind of coalition it takes for either candidate to win the presidency. So this is the starting map of where we are today. I took some liberties here. And so I turned two states blue that might be toss-up states. I turned Nevada blue, so right here, and I turned Virginia blue. And the polls here are pretty clear that Joe Biden is going to win these two states. I also turned Texas red, even though Biden is within the margin of error, and I turned Iowa red, even though Biden is within the margin of error. Just historically, these two states tend to go red in presidential elections. So if the election were today, and this was the starting point, Biden would start with 233 electoral votes. So he would still need 37 electoral votes to get to 270. Trump is starting with about 170, so he would need 100 electoral votes. And that's where these brown-colored states come into play. Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states. This is where the election will be decided. It's in these 8 states. And whoever gets the most votes in some kind of combination of these 8 states will be able to claim victory. So Biden's starting with 233. The big story for him is if he can win the states around the Great Lakes, so Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, that puts him at 279. He doesn't have to worry about Arizona, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, or Ohio. Trump, meanwhile, starting at 170, will need Florida. He thinks he's going to win Florida. He thinks he's going to win Ohio. He thinks he'll win Georgia, North Carolina. So that brings him to 248, in which case he still needs to get to 270. So he'll need some kind of combination of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona. If he gets Pennsylvania, he's still not there. So he would need 2 of these 4 states then. I'm just going to change all of these back. Okay. Georgia. Okay, so this is our starting point here. The one thing that I think that this election might have dramatic long-term effects on is the partisan orientation toward the Electoral College. Right now, Democrats think that the Electoral College is bad, that it hinders their chances of winning, and that they're more likely to win the popular vote. Republicans are more likely to win the electoral vote. But what happens if we flip some of these states, and some of these states start becoming left-leaning or blue-leaning towards Democrats? And this is a really scary thing for Republicans right now. And it really comes down to 3 states for Republicans. One would be Arizona. So if we just look at the historical trend over the last 8 years in Arizona, in 2012, Republicans won the state by 9 points. In 2016, they won it by 4. And in 2020, the best polls are showing that Biden is up by 5. So that's an 18-point switch toward the Democratic Party. In Georgia, Republicans won it by 8 points in 2012, by 5 points in 2016, and it seems to be about even right now. It's neck and neck in Georgia. And then the one that's really scary, the one that's really scaring the Republican Party is what's happening in Texas. So Texas in 2012 went to the Republican by 16 points. In 2016, it went to Trump by 9 points. And the best polls today have Trump ahead by 4 points in 2020. But the trend is trending more blue, or at the very least, Arizona and Texas and Georgia are all trending toward purple, toward toss-up states, kind of like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. So if these states come into play for the Democratic Party, it leaves the margin of error even smaller for the Republican Party. I mean, look what would happen if, let's say, Arizona became a reliably Democratic state. If we add Arizona, if Arizona becomes blue, Biden goes up, the Biden coalition, the Democratic coalition, goes up to 244 votes that they can count on. The really scary thing for the Republican Party would be, what if Texas becomes a bluish purple state? So I don't think Texas will ever go blue, and I don't think Texas is going to go to Biden in this election. I could be wrong, though. But if it were to, if Texas were to become somewhat bluish, then it's over. The race is over. The Democrats have 271 electoral votes. It doesn't matter what happens in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. The election is over, and Democrats can already claim victory. And so the trend in some of these states is toward Democratic gains. And if that continues, then the Republican Party cannot win at all. The Republican Party thinks they can win right now under the Electoral College because they think that the rules favor them. But if under this system things keep going the way they are, trending in the direction the way they are, Republicans will have no chance whatsoever. And so the incentive structure will be completely flipped. Sorry, get back to that. Showing my face here for a second. The incentive structure will be completely flipped. Texas goes push or even possibly blue. But even if Georgia or Arizona become in contention and Texas is a toss-up as well, again, the margin of error for the Republican Party is just razor thin. They'll have to win a bunch of toss-up states, and that's hard to do if the Democratic Party knows it and can pour tons of resources into just a couple states. They could ignore, for example, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and they could pour all of their money into just Florida and Pennsylvania. And if they just win those 2 states, for instance, maybe Democrats could win the election. So Republicans then will be incentivized to get rid of the Electoral College. You might be thinking, well, why would they do that? Republicans have tended not to win the popular vote in recent elections. Even in elections where they won the presidency, they lost the popular vote. In 2000, George W. Bush lost the popular vote to Al Gore. In 2016, Donald Trump lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton. And I think Republicans might go for a popular vote because, and this is a little speculative, but I could be wrong, but I really do think that there might be a silent majority in this country that doesn't show up to vote. A majority of Americans live in rural areas. And when I talk about rural, I don't mean suburban. I mean places in towns that 10,000 people, and many 5,000 people. That's where a majority of this country lives. And the rural areas are just more ideologically homogenous than the metropolitan areas. Put very simply, there are more Republicans in the big cities than there are Democrats in the country. And so all those Republicans who live in the country, they don't show up to vote because they don't think their vote matters. Their state, say in Alabama, for example, it's going to go red to vote. Whereas if they went to a popular vote, they might feel like their vote counts and that the Republican Party needs them. They don't need them in Alabama. Alabama's going to go red. But if it's a popular vote, then maybe the Republican Party needs them to show up. And so if Texas, Georgia, Arizona, those three states continue the trend of going more blue, becoming purplish and possibly even blue, then it changes the calculus for which party wants the Electoral College and which party wants to get rid of it. And if Republicans figure that out before Democrats do, there might be a bipartisan coalition to get rid of the Electoral College and move to a popular vote, because both parties will think it's in their best interest to do so. All right. Well, thank you for your time. I hope you learn other stuff from this seminar. Bye-bye.
Well, that's given us some good food for thought to kick off with, hasn't it? So let's now transition and hand over, if I may please, to Youssef Chouhoud. So Youssef, you must have some views on where are we heading, what's in store for us next week, what are the implications, whether on the Electoral College or in some other ways, you know, what are the implications of this election?
Yes, thank you so much, Allyson. And it's a real pleasure to join you and to join all those in the audience. Pretty large audience too. So let me tell you where the position that I'm kind of looking at this from. I'm kind of a weird creature when it comes to political science. I'm neither fish nor fowl. My interests in the discipline aren't fully housed either within American politics or comparative politics, the typical, you know, kind of umbrella subdivisions of our discipline. And so when I look at presidential elections and you know, the one coming up being no different, I tend to switch out the lenses that I use to analyze that election and the implications, probably a bit more than most. So looking at things from a comparative perspective, I say that primarily I'm concerned with the continued deterioration of democracy in America and how this trend may reverberate across the globe. And so you mentioned a little bit in the beginning with your comments about brand America and how it's seen better days, and that's important. And I don't mean to be, I'm not. This isn't taking a kind of very kind of American centric view of things. Democratic backsliding in Hungary, democratic backsliding in Poland, it's lamentable. It's something that we should, it's noteworthy, right? But it's qualitatively different than when the United States starts exhibiting these implications of deterioration within its own borders. And I don't want to make it seem that the United States is kind of this unmoved mover either. I'm very much a proponent that the United States is not this oh so special snowflake that is irresistible to the social forces that are at play in societies across the globe. Recently, I spoke to Dr. Liesl Hintz for a webinar that I moderated. I was playing the Allyson at that time, and we were talking about the Turkish model and her view. So the Turkish model initially was this model of how you have democracy in a Muslim majority country, but she thinks that there's now a new Turkish model of how you rapidly de-democratize a country. And you go through the checklist, and we are just one after another going through each and every one of those steps here in the United States. Demonization of the media, packing the judiciary with loyalists, so on and so forth. So that's primarily, I think, the main thing that I'm concerned about. Switching my lens to a more American politics lens, my research in the American politics sphere is primarily on racial and ethnic minorities, and more specifically on American Muslims. Now, American Muslims don't make up a large proportion of citizens here in the U.S. It's around 1%, depending on who you ask. And so for them, this election is crucial because in my estimation, it's going to be, we're going to look back on it, a couple of cycles down the road and really signify this moment as one that propelled an American Muslim political consciousness, I think, where they really started to cohere as a group on the political scene that has something to say, and that others want to hear from. But again, it's a very small proportion of the electorate. And so among American Muslims, but among minorities more generally, I think the trend that we really should keep an eye on is the extent to which this election allows for a tighter mode of coalition building. Is it kind of a centripetal force, right? Bringing these minority groups together. Because if we see that, that's going to be a tremendous phenomenon that's going to have long-lasting ramifications for politics in the United States moving forward. And it really comes down to whether the activists and leaders within these communities are able to frame the impetus for coalition building clearly. Put simply, can they frame it as, it's not us apples and them being oranges, us, Muslims and, oranges being African Americans, or oranges being, Hispanics. Like, no, we're actually all just different types of apples. And we need to think how we can, progress the apple agenda in the United States. And then lastly, kind of putting back my comparativist lens for a moment, again, I can't help but think about the U.S. and the world, and especially my part of the world in the Middle East. So, I was born in Egypt, and still have a lot of connections back there. And so, the U.S. engagement with the world has been problematic in the Middle East, over the past couple of decades or so, going back even further than that, and yet, the retreat from the Middle East has brought about a slew of problems in itself as well. Now, nature just simply abhors a vacuum, and we're seeing a number of great powers, both globally and regionally, kind of flexing their muscle to step into that vacuum that the U.S. has created. And some may say, China and Russia, hey, they're not so bad. Certainly not any worse than the United States. And that's just an underestimation of the highest order in my in my viewpoint. And you just need to ask the Uyghurs, to confirm that, right? A stronger, unchecked China on the international stage is, put simply, just not good for the vulnerable in this world. Now, I'd like to clarify, I'm not being idealistic here. It's hard to talk about this issue with a lot of nuance, and my conversations with my relatives back in Egypt is all the evidence you need in that regard. But perhaps the best way to kind of encapsulate my position is to paraphrase the title of a recent book on democracy. Benevolent American hegemony may have never existed, but boy, we're going to miss it when it's gone. So I'll end there, and I'm looking forward to engaging on these and other topics during our conversation. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Youssef. Really, you've struck so many themes that I've been writing down, and I will probably, if I don't watch it, dominate the Q&A session, so I'm going to control myself. Fantastic. Thank you. So please, can we now hear from you, Parker, your view of where are we going? What's this all going to mean? All of us on this call are obviously very interested in and wanting clarity after Tuesday. We may not get it, but I'm sure you must have some thoughts on where are we being led?
Sure. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. So first of all, Allyson, thank you so much for moderating, and thanks Simon, for the invitation to appear on the panel. I was taught long ago to be very leery of any invitation from Simon Radford, but so far this event is turning out to be a delight. And I should also mention that we had a colleague who taught for a few years at a university in India. And back in fall of 2016, my wife had to go to Delhi on business, and I tagged along with her and gave a talk at our friend's university where I quite confidently predicted a Hillary Clinton victory in the 2016 presidential election. So if you're looking for clarity, I may not be the person to go to. My crystal ball is smudged at best. And I think a lot of people in the United States after 2016, you know, it was a real sobering moment, I think, for many people in America. And I think it's not just those on the political left, that it was a very cataclysmic election. And I think that the events of the last 4 years have really borne out just what a sea change it was in American politics. And it seems to me that to people abroad, America seems capable of the most wild swings of doing things on the one hand that may be inspiring, that may be cause for you know, hope around the world, and then on the other hand, doing things that are absolutely terrifying and that to the outside world are to be frank, quite mystifying. And you know, I think as a political scientist who studies American politics and Texas politics, which is where I live, you know, it's been difficult for all of us, I think, to wrap our heads around the events of the last 4 years. And I think learning from people like our friend, Dr. Chouhoud, who's a comparativist, or at least somewhat of a comparativist by training. He says he's neither fish nor fowl, but I think that people who study comparative politics have had a lot to teach, have had a lot to teach those of us who study American politics over the last 4 years, because they've really been able to put the last 4 years in some kind of international perspective, which I think has been quite helpful. As to where we're going and as to providing clarity for what's going to happen on Tuesday in the United States, you know, all I can do, I think, at the moment is sort of talk through where things look from my vantage. And as you mentioned, I'm a professor in Texas. I'm actually a native Texan, except for my 5 years in lovely Los Angeles. I've spent my entire life here in Texas. And so I think I want to talk for a moment just about where the election stands in Texas. And Dave Bridge in his video mentioned a little bit about what would happen in the Electoral College if Texas were to go blue. But I think it's worth talking about what things look like here right now, and especially in the context of what we call in America, or what some people call the New South, which Texas is a part of. And thinking about the demographic changes that are taking place in some states, and how they may have an effect on this presidential election. So, as I mentioned, I'm a native Texan, and I live in Dallas, which is where I'm talking to you from today. And against, you know, sort of going against popular conceptions, the big cities in Texas are all actually quite liberal. And so I sit here today, there's probably 2 or 3 Trump yard signs within a mile radius of my house, which, you know, is obviously an anecdotal measure, but I think it colors kind of all of our opinions here in America about when we try to analyze trends and analyze what's happening. And the reason why I'm bringing up sort of my own position is to try to convey what would happen, I guess, if Texas were, if Biden were to win Texas. So Texas, as Dave mentioned, has 38 electoral college votes. And as Dave also mentioned, the New York Times, in partnership with Siena College, just released a poll yesterday or the day before that shows Trump up 4 points in the state of Texas, which, as Dave mentioned, would be the closest margin in any presidential election in Texas in quite some time. Trump won the state by 9 points in 2016. And to put it frankly, if Biden wins Texas on Tuesday night, the election is over, and it's probably over on election night. Now, whether that's possible, whether it's actually possible for him to win here, I'm not entirely convinced. I think that the Biden-Harris campaign has started to show some inklings that they think it is in play. For example, Kamala Harris is traveling to Texas on Friday, and she's going to go to Houston. She's going to go to a place in the Rio Grande Valley, which is on the border of Mexico and has a huge number of Latino voters who tend to exhibit pretty low turnout in presidential elections. And she's also going to go to Fort Worth, which is my neighboring city here in Dallas. If Texas were to turn blue, as I mentioned, it would be a pretty cataclysmic event for the Republican Party. And I'm not sure I totally agree with Professor Bridges' comments about what would happen in terms of Republicans wanting to get rid of the Electoral College. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that in the chat. If Texas were to turn blue, it would certainly represent a come to Jesus moment, I think, for the Republican Party, because they would have some thinking to do. And if Texas goes blue, I should also mention that other states in what some people have called the growth South, so Georgia being one of them, North Carolina is another, Virginia is another, Florida, although Florida is kind of its own special case. If Texas goes blue, those other states have probably also gone blue as well. And Texas's Electoral College votes then would not be needed by the Biden campaign. But what's interesting, and I think it's something to keep an eye on, not only in this election, but in future elections, is the demographics of America. Texas in 2000, for example, Texas had 20 million residents, and today it has just shy of 30 million residents. So in 20 years, Texas's population has grown by a third. It's the second largest state by population in the United States, behind California. And it occupies such an important place in the electoral map for Republicans that if the state's voting patterns begin to catch up to its demography, that's going to put Republicans at a distinct national disadvantage. And the answer for them for a long time here in Texas has been to try to keep people from voting, which I'm sad to say Texas is not really a red state, it's more of a non-voting state. And that's been the case for a long time. And we've even seen it here, for example, or we've even seen it in this election. For example, Harris County, which is the home of Houston, it's got 4.5 million people by some measures behind Los Angeles County. It's the most diverse county in the United States. For 4.5 million people, there is one drop box for ballots that people can go drop their ballots off before Election Day, so they don't have to stand in line on November 3rd. By contrast, Los Angeles County, which of course has double the population, but it also has over 400 drop box locations for ballots. And so, you know, in this day and age where we can order something on Amazon Prime in the morning and have it sitting on our doorsteps in the afternoon, the idea of having to suffer through these anachronistic and racist voting practices, quite frankly, is an abomination. And so it's these things that Texas, voters in Texas have had to overcome and will have to overcome in order to exhibit sort of the levels of suffrage that I think many are waiting for them to in this state. And I will say that the evidence in this election, at least, is promising in that regard. So there are 10 counties in Texas. Texas has 254 counties, and there are 10 of them, very populous suburban counties in particular, that have already exceeded their 2016 vote totals. So not just in early voting, but their total voting in 2016. Now, of course, both parties have been, incentivized to vote early. To the extent that Republicans in the state think that the coronavirus is a real thing, they probably want to avoid standing in line with everybody else too on November 3rd. So it could be that some of the election day turnout is sort of cannibalizing itself in terms of early voting. But it'll remain to be seen. And if you look at maps of early voting in America and who's voted thus far, Texas and California and Florida are actually leading the pack. And there's some data that suggests that many of these voters, a larger than expected share of them at least, are first-time voters. And so I think political scientists and election experts all over America are trying to parse out what these early voting numbers mean. And I'm not here to suggest that I have any answers, but I do think that we're about to see an unprecedented turnout figure in the state of Texas. And I think that not many people know exactly what that means, but we're about to find out. So anyway, that's about all I have to say thus far. And like everybody else, I'm eagerly, I guess eagerly is the right word, I'm awaiting Tuesday with some sense of eagerness and some sense of dread and trepidation also probably. So anyway, the liquor cabinet will be well stocked on Monday night and maybe also Tuesday, maybe also Wednesday too. So anyway, I will cede the floor now to Allyson and Professor Berry, but thanks for having me.
Great, thank you very much, Parker. Boy, that's fascinating. I didn't appreciate that picture of Texas, to be perfectly honest. And yeah, it's very different to the Texas or the US and the Texas, I guess, I left in '88. So Justin, last but not least, give us your perspectives on where are we going? What's next week got in store?
Can you hear me now? Excellent. All right, I'm gonna try to share my screen here if that's possible. It says that you have to allow me.
So James, are you able to
It says host disabled. Yeah.
James, are you able to make Justin a host? Oh, you are now, Justin. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Let me make sure. Okay. All right. Let's see. All right, are people able to see my screen now? Oh, man.
I'm afraid we can't, no.
Okay, I'll try one last time here, and if it doesn't work, I will abandon. Now can you see it?
We can.
Okay, great. All right, so basically what I wanted to, first off, I just want to note that my research interest is race and ethnicity and political behavior. And I focus a lot on the role of white identity in recent political behavior. But I know that my time is really limited. And so I was thinking about what people would want to know most about. And I thought since I live and teach in the Midwest and the election is most likely going to hinge, as Dave already talked about in the Midwest, I'd really share with you where we are in the polls and the forecast in regards to the Midwest and what to look for on Tuesday. And if there's questions about race and ethnicity, I'd love to talk further about it in the question and answer session. All right, so basically, first off, I think it's really important in light of 2016, right? And in regards to knowing my audience, when we think about the Brexit and the polls in regards to Brexit and all the unpredictability of it, I just wanted to take a minute to talk about the limitations of polls and also talk about how they're different from forecast models. Like everybody's watching 538, the forecast model, Sabato, crystal ball, right? And so it's, before I talk about what the polls are, I just want you to figure out kind of what they tell us and what their limitations are, right? So when we're talking about surveys and polls, we're really talking about something that is explanatory, right? It's something that's trying to give you a snapshot in time of a particular sample of the population, right? It's not really meant to be predictive of a future outcome, right? And so the accuracy of a poll is really based upon the quality of the sample. Like, does the people that they actually sampled and the people that they're able to actually speak to, is it reflective of the general population they're trying to reflect, right? And so we have to always remember that there's a margin of error to polls, right? Now, contrast that to forecast models, which again, everybody's watching 538, right? A forecast model is an entirely different thing. It you know, often aggregates polls, right? And even weighs the accuracy of those polls, right? But it also incorporates a number of other, you know, factors aside from asking people things, right? That we know as, you know, political scientists in past elections help predict presidential or electoral outcomes, right? And so they'll include things like, is there an incumbent in the race, endorsements, fundraising, candidate quality, what's the state of the economy, and so on and so forth, right? And when we think about the accuracy of forecast models, right, it's dependent upon the extent to A, the input is accurate, right? Are the polls accurate, right? And then second, it's also dependent upon how you know, their kind of recipe of the fundamentals. Like, how important are those fundamentals in predicting electoral outcomes in this election versus 2018, 16, whatever, right? And so when we think about that, you know, just like polls have a margin of error, you know, the probability of forecast models is also, you know, probabilistic, right? So having said that, right, when we think about why might the polls not predict an election result, right? So before I share the polls in, you know, the Midwest, right, we have to think about polling error, right? And so we need to think about like the ways in which the polls could get it wrong. First, sampling bias, right? This was a really, you know, big thing in 2016, like in predicting the outcome in the presidential election, right? It's the idea that the people that you sample are not actually representative of the actual electorate that cast their vote, right? And one of the big things that, you know, pollsters identified as an error in their sampling was that they didn't sample on the basis of college education. And because of the fact that there was such a gap in vote choice between college educated and non-college educated, particularly amongst white voters, right, the sampling had a degree of sampling error. And it was biased in one direction, right, under predicting Trump support. Second is, and actually Youssef and I wrote an article on this, right? It's the idea also of non-response bias, right? It's difficult to contact certain populations, right? By nature of their structural position in society, language factors, you know, whether they have permanent addresses or not, whether they're in the voter registration files, right? And so that sometimes, even though the people you're trying to contact is representative of the population, you're just not able to contact those people, right? And then the third is response bias, right? You can get the right frame, right? And you can contact the right people, but at the end of the day, it's dependent upon people giving you accurate answers, right? And so there's a lot of people debating this notion of the shy Trump voter, right? Are there these people that to your face and to the pollsters are saying they're never Trumpers, but then when they close the booth, you know, the curtain at the booth, they might do something different, right? And so that's one way in which the polls could be wrong, is that the practice and methodology or the limitations of polling is just not a perfect predictor of, you know, the population at that time, right? But then there's the other part of things is, and this is kind of the difference between polls and forecast models, is they're meant to be snapshots. They're explanatory. They're not meant to be predictive, right? And so the polls could get it like perfectly correct and still not predict electoral outcomes, right? Because there's some degree of gap between when they're polled and when people actually cast their vote, right? And so the accuracy of polls in terms of predicted power is really dependent upon, you know, the stability of voter preferences, right? And so we can think from, you know, now until election day, right? There might be some event that shifts people's mind, right? It's the time period is limited. And for that reason, we would think that polls would be more predictive because the gap between when they're asked and when they vote is small, right? But, you know, people study in 2016, like the Comey email and everything about that, the last moment, did that shift enough people at the margins to alter, you know, the outcome of the election, right? The second thing is what's the stability of actual voter preferences, right? To what extent do people actually have a clear first choice, right? And we know in 2016, there was a large number of voters who didn't have very stable preferences, right? There is something up around 20% of the electorate, you know, were undecided, right? And so for that reason, there's going to be greater variability in the polls. And then finally, people might not change their voter preference, but they might change whether or not they actually vote, right? So when we're thinking about the polls and we're thinking about predicting the outcome in, on Tuesday, it's not just a matter of what people's preferences are, right? It's the extent to which they're actually going to turn out to vote, right? And so, having said that and trying to, defend, our practice, right? Let's move on to take a look, at the polls, right? So if we take a look at the polling average, and Dave made a really important point that, obviously if you're not following American politics, you might look at the top line here. This is from Real Clear Politics and say, well, Biden has a 7-point margin of victory. But as Dave explained, right, our electoral design is not based on the national popular vote, right? And that's predictive somewhat of how elections go. But as we saw in 2016, you can win the popular vote and lose the electoral college and not be president, right? And so we're really most interested in states. But one thing that is important, if we take a look at the margin here of the national popular vote, is notice here the stability of voter preferences, right? The gap between Biden and Trump has really not shifted throughout the course of the general election, which suggests that people's preferences, are relatively stable, even though there's events that have occurred. There's been debates, there's been, up and down in COVID, right? There's been all these factors, and yet preferences have remained pretty baked in, right? This is polarized America, right? So if we turn to this map, and this is a similar map, I use the same website as Dave did, right? 270 to win, right? He already explained what this map is showing you, right? But if we notice here, what I want you to focus in on is what's different about this election versus 2016 is not necessarily which states are competitive, right? The map looks really similar to 2016. It's the same general states. The difference is there's just more states that are competitive this election than there was at the same time in 2016, right? And if we take a look of, let's see, actually, let's look at this slide, right? I'm sorry. I don't want to skip ahead, my bad, right? So if we look, there's basically two regions that we want to focus in on. We want to focus in on the Midwest, right? Which I'm going to reference as the Rust Belt, right? This region running from Minnesota and Iowa up through Pennsylvania, right? We see a number of competitive states here with a large number of electoral votes. And also, what both Dave and Parker referred to earlier, of which Texas is a part, the Sun Belt, running from Georgia and Florida out to Arizona, right? Those are the competitive regions in this election. And if we look at these regions from last week, right? Generally in presidential elections, there's a tightening, right? That people go back home to their party as the election, comes close. And we see, if you take a look at the electoral map last week versus the polls today that I just pulled off, this is off of, again, 270 to win, right? If we take a look at that, we notice that the movement in the polls is moving in the direction of the Midwest, leaning towards the Democratic Party. And the South, right? The South, in essence, today, that, these states in Georgia and Florida are remaining, battleground states. And the thing that we have to remember, however, if you take a look at 2016 versus 2020, take a look at the map of the two regions that are important today. Those were the same regions that were important in 2016, and they were meant to be competitive. Yet in 2016, Donald Trump won slim majorities in the majority of those states, and in so doing won the presidency. Right? And so what I want to focus in on here is the Rust Belt, right? These states in the Midwest that both, Dave mentioned before, I think really are the key states to this presidential race. So if we take a look here at these states, right, what we want to look at is the gap between the candidates. We want to understand the margin of error, right? We want to know the trends across states, in which direction the polls are moving, right? So if we take a look here, Michigan, my home state, right? Michigan, Biden has a pretty sizable lead, and it hasn't really changed over the past month, right? It's looking like a pretty stable state for the Democrats. Pennsylvania, on the other hand, a key state with actually more electoral votes. is really close. You know, the gap, the most recent aggregated gap here from Real Clear Politics is 4 points. The margin of error in most of these polls is 3 to 4 points, right? That basically tells you Pennsylvania is in all practice is a toss-up. And the polls are moving in the direction towards Trump, right? That the gap in Pennsylvania has decreased, you know, over the past 2 weeks. It's tightening. If we turn to Wisconsin, a state that really Trump surprised in 2016, Wisconsin looks more like Michigan than it does Pennsylvania, right? The gap is large, and it's moving in the direction of an increased lead for Biden. Iowa, again, very much a toss-up state, as Dave mentioned, right? The margin for Biden is within the margin of error. It's a toss-up, but the polls have been slightly trending in Biden's favor. In Ohio, a state that typically goes red, right, again, looks like it's going to go red. And it's been moving towards greater support for Trump. So once again, if we think about that, and if we think about the presidency, we really want to be focused in on Tuesday on these states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, for the most part, those 3 states. And again, if we look at the polls today, and if we look at the forecast models from 538, I mean, this looks good for a Biden victory. But again, if we go back to 2016 and look at these same polls and the same forecast models for Clinton in October of that year, it also looked good for Clinton, right? It just looked slightly better for Biden this election than it did for her in these individual states. And so kind of the final kind of question that the final point that I want to make here is that everybody in the room, everybody I talk to when I talk to about the polls are like, yeah, but can we trust the polls, right? We all remember Brexit. We all remember 2016. We all remember how, the forecast models got it wrong, right? And so what we need to look at, and I just pulled this off of New York Times, they basically say, if we had a similar polling error as we did in 2016, based on the current polls, what would the outcome look like, right? And when we see that they correct for those polling errors, things still look pretty good for Biden in the Midwest. And as Dave said, if Biden wins the Midwest, he'll win the presidency, right? And so for that reason, it still looks good even if we have a similar polling error. And what I try to post here are the arrows. Is these are the states that had the largest polling error in 2016. And again, notice that they were mostly in the Midwest. But even adjusting for a similar error, right, it's still Biden winning those states by a slim majority. And so the final kind of thing that if we think about what polling error would look like today versus 2020, there's multiple reasons to think that maybe the polling error will be less this election. Right? So if we look at it, first off, most pollsters sampled on college education this time around. They kind of learned their lesson on that, right? Number 2, over 40 million people, and that was, actually a few days ago, over 40 million people have already cast their vote, meaning the polls actually predict their voting when they cast their vote, right? Number 3, there's far fewer, the preferences are more stable this election. There's far fewer undecided voters that will shift at the last moment, right? It's been cut in half based on the polls. And then finally, the forecast models have also kind of learned their lesson, are tending to model with greater uncertainty in their models. And finally, this idea of herding effects, right? If anything, pollsters are herding towards under predicting the margin of support of Biden. Right. In the fact that, again, they don't want to be on the outlier saying this is going to be a landslide election and then be wrong. Right. And so those are kind of my points. And I look forward to question and answer. Thanks, guys.
That's super interesting, Justin. Thank you very much indeed. I've certainly taken a lot away also from your analysis as well. Wow. The floor is, the chat room is open, I should say. And I'm just going to now turn to some of the many questions here. They aren't specifically directed at any one of our panelists. So whichever of you, the three of you, wish to tackle it, please feel free to speak up. So let me start with a question here from Seth. So Seth asks, is fear of extinction for a party anything new? Certainly voter suppression practiced by both parties at different times and born out of necessity from fear of extinction is nothing new. So who would like to take that question?
I'll talk for a minute. The two-party system in America, Seth, as you know, has been an incredibly stable feature of American politics. And this is despite some real wipeout electoral losses that both sides have had. The Democrats in 1972 and again in 1984 in Reagan's reelection, and in 72 in the McGovern-Nixon race. The Republicans lost, elections by enormous amounts in the 1930s during FDR's terms as president, and sort of again, actually, in kind of a mini landslide in 2008. And so I don't think you're right, that fear of party extinction, I think, is A, nothing new in American politics, and B, in this sense, is sort of overblown. But I think that what both parties really need to be aware of is that party realignment, in particular in American politics, is something that can happen again. And I think Dave sort of hinted at that in his video, talking about how if certain things were to happen, the Electoral College could be kind of a cross-cutting issue that would lead both parties to want to make some changes in American politics. And I think your question actually ties into Simon's question that he asked in the chat, which is, if Democrats lose, it'll most probably be because they fail to convince working class voters to turn up and vote for them. We know that white working class voters, in particular, as Justin pointed out, whites without a college degree have been Trump's most kind of stable base of support throughout his entire presidency. And as for the Democrats trying to lure some of those voters back into the fold, I think that is certainly one strategy. I think another strategy is, and this sounds maybe a little harsh, but is writing that particular group of voters off and pursuing a different set of voters. And when I talked in my brief remarks about sort of the New South and the demographic changes that have hit states like Florida and Texas, where you have young people, you have people of color, people who have not been brought into the political process for whatever reason, if you were to instead try to lure those voters into participating and into being members of your party, I think, to me, that's a more fruitful strategy than to spend resources, hundreds of millions of dollars trying to convince a 68-year-old white man in Pennsylvania that in their two presidential elections that they have left, they need to come back to the Democratic Party. And so I think this is sort of a roundabout way of talking about party extinction, but it is, I think, an important question. And I think it speaks to the party's attempts to try to find new voters and figure out what their paths forward after this election look like.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. I don't know if you have anything to add, Justin or Youssef, to that point.
I'll just real quick follow up. Yes, so the point that Parker was making, to dovetail off that point at the end there. I mean, this question of, is it anything new? The concept itself may not be necessarily new, but the underlying circumstances have certainly changed. And the underlying circumstances is, primarily, what demographers have called in kind of a colloquial way, the browning of America, right? When you don't have a white Christian majority anymore, that's going to activate a lot of threat impulses in that white Christian group that was previously the majority, right? So back in 2014 was the first time that we had more minority births than white births in the country. And so, you have these demographic shifts. And so the coalitions are more and more reflecting either a leaning into that democratic shift or pushing against that democratic shift. And, demography being what it is, I mean, over time, you either have to rig the system or, lean into that shift a bit more. And we've seen what that party that has been pushing back against it has opted to do this election cycle.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Fascinating. Thank you. So let's see. We have a question from Nicholas. I'm wondering what our panelists think about the likelihood of electoral violence in American politics now and in the future. Framed seriously, many of the countries that Youssef mentioned as having democratic backsliding now have electoral violence as a recurring feature in their politics, either before, during, or right after major elections. Will that be the case in the US? Framed less seriously, what do I tell my mother, who lives in a wealthy Washington, D.C. suburb, who asked me last night if she, quote, needs to prepare for the election like a hurricane? Great question.
Yes, I guess I'll start by saying I was trying to take my mic off for the last question, so I just want to add one note to that. And so I think basically just to add to what both Parker and Youssef said, if you look at like who makes up the electorate, right? There was something written in the Washington Post the other day, right? That the members of the white working class are making up a shrinking part of the electorate, right? And so the percent of non-college educated whites is shrinking. Right. So if you're going to rely on mobilizing that base, I'm thinking the Republican Party with Trump in 2016 has pretty much squeezed that lemon dry. Right. And it's the hardest to mobilize people of low income. Right. The turnout rates tend to be the lowest. Right. And so but then the second thing that Youssef was saying, like that definitely there's a demographic shift. Right. And that Latinos, Asian Americans making up a larger part of the electorate via immigration. Right. But, demography is not destiny. Right. And that we'd have to actually see that there's been huge gains. I was just looking at Latino decisions, which is a great source of data on Latino voting for people out there. And AAPI, which is another great one. Janelle Wong, former USC professor. Right. And they both, when I look at the data, they both are stressing that there's been a lot of strides amongst the Latino and Asian American community in terms of voter registration. But there hasn't been a huge amount of strides in voter turnout of that population, right? And so there's still so if Democrats, and it's a big if, right? It's not necessarily natural that Latinos and Asians will be Democratic voters moving forward, right? There's still a contested population, recent immigrants, right? But if they're able to mobilize this group, there's a lot more people to mobilize and actually to turn into voters. And I think that the Republican Party has been helping out the Democrats left and right recently on their stands towards immigration, right? But actually, if you look at the polling, that Latinos are similar to other people, that they care a lot about healthcare, they care about jobs, right? And so it's not merely just an issue of immigration, but there's more people to mobilize than there are amongst white working class.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Justin. So, thinking back to Nicholas's concerns about violence next week after, what are your respective views, if any of you would like to tackle that one about the possibility? How does he help his Washington, D.C. mother prepare for the election?
So I don't know if the violence is going to spill all the way to the NDZ's posh Washington suburban home, but I think the possibility is a lot higher than a lot of people really give it credit for. And it's not like the writing wasn't on the wall. I mean, if you look at Pew data that came out not too long ago, a quarter of Democrats feel that the Republican Party is a threat to the nation's well-being. A third of Republicans feel the same way about Democrats. That's not the type of situation, right? So this rhetoric of the other group is not just a threat to our way of life, but a threat to you specifically. That is just a recipe for getting folks out and actually doing something about it. And as somebody who studies political tolerance, I can tell you that it's a lot easier to make folks intolerant and act on that intolerance than it is to kind of rein that intolerance in and convince them otherwise. That has been the project that we've been trying here in America as a multicultural society for many decades to various degrees of success. But right now we seem to be losing the battle, and I would not be surprised if we saw a scale of electoral violence that we have not seen here in America in kind of recent memory.
Justin, Parker, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I was just going to add one thing is that to me, the threat of violence is violence, right? And so the idea that there's this mere threat out there, right, that impacts, the quality of democracy and people's, how they interact in the democratic electoral system, right? So we are already experiencing violence in politics, right? And then the other thing, I have to say, I live in Michigan. There was a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan by an extremist white supremacist group. So it's not even a threat anymore, right? It actually is violent.
Yeah, I would concur with both Youssef and Justin. Nick, I think your mom and the Northwest quadrant of DC is probably safe and sound. But yeah, and I agree with Justin too, that the threat of violence in and of itself is violence. To the extent that anybody feels threatened to go exercise their rights, even if they're never actually, laid a finger on, that is in some ways equally damaging. I'll also just say that American politics has always been violent. It hasn't been violent to the extent around election time, maybe, that it has been in other places, but we have, no shortage of history of violent episodes that have marred our politics. And I think it's easy for some of us who are younger or haven't been doing this for as long as other people have to remember that those times, weren't so long ago necessarily. But yeah, that's what I have to say.
Thank you. Well, we've got a question from Walter Ladwig, who many of us know. So Walter asks Youssef specifically, Youssef, can you say a bit more, please, about democratic erosion in the US? Is this down to a single demagogue, or is it something more structural?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Walter. So the answer is yes. It certainly has been heightened and put into sharp relief with the current demagogue in chief. However, it is, this is actually a feature and not a bug of American democracy, and it just has been, held in check to this point, based on, this deference to democratic norms. Parker mentioned in the beginning about how comparativists have been talking about democracy and how it lives and dies across the globe, and what we might learn about that pattern, about that life cycle here in the US. The foremost book in that regard is aptly named How Democracies Die. And they talk about, what holds a democracy together is this you can't be a ham-fisted majoritarian, when you have power to do absolutely everything that is within your power to do. You have to hold back a little bit, right? And to the extent that we see that this impetus, this norm of holding back has been effectively eroded, there have to be some structural changes made, or else we're just going to keep going down that very steep and very sliding slope.
Yeah. Thank you. Next question from Andrew to anyone on the panel. How about the importance of millennials and Generation Z in this election? Speaking as a Gen Zer, I feel that the chaos of the current political system has inspired many to register and do all they can to encourage peers to register and vote. Because there was a large amount of younger people that sat out the last election that have now registered to vote, is it wise to rely on their vote as a possibility of swaying the election a certain way? Any views, Justin, Parker?
Well, I would say that the first thing is that, I mean, if you look at like voter turnout amongst youngster generations across American history, if you're looking for them to be the turner of an election, you might be looking in the wrong place, right? That the turnout tends to be very low amongst this population. And, you know, I was just looking at data in my class the other day, and it really doesn't, it's not just 18 to 25-year-olds, right? It's 18 all the way up to 35-year-olds, right? That's where like turnout is really low, right? And so, but I guess my like glimmer of hope is like when I see my students really engage politically in terms of, you know, political discourse, they seem to be far more engaged. Like they're more engaged in like protests and engaging in social movements, you know, and really talking about like policy change that they know has to come through, you know, actual electoral politics. And so there's that hope that maybe this generation that they'll be actually able to translate that, you know, non-electoral form of politics into electoral forms of politics, right? And so that's the hope. That's the hope. But again, you know, data on turnout, you know, it would have to be something different.
Yeah, absolutely. Parker, Youssef, anything you'd like to add?
I agree with Justin's sort of anecdotal impressions. So I teach, and I've been there now for the last 8 years at a primarily women's university. We have an 88% female student body, and we also have a lot of students who are the first people in their family to go to college. And we're a high serving Hispanic institution as well. And what I've really been struck by over the last 4 years is really the Trump presidency has brought out an incredible amount of energy from my students. And these are students who fall actually into multiple, often intersecting sort of demographic categories of people that have been difficult to engage with politically over decades. And I think that early turnout data, as I was mentioning during my remarks, to the extent that we can glean anything from it, we are seeing a sharp increase in first-time voters, which I think is great. But the 18 to 29-year-old demographic has been a political sort of pot of gold for politicians in America and in other democracies too for a really long time. And I do think that in some ways, the last 4 years has shaken Gen Z out of some of its sense of complacency. You know, and also I think that's just a function too of the population, of that particular population getting 4 years older, you know, and we tend to see political engagement increase as age increases. And so I think that's some sort of natural byproduct of that happening too. But yeah, there are certainly a number of groups that could stand to participate more in American politics. And if they did participate more, our electoral map would probably look quite differently. And Gen Z is for sure one of them.
Yeah, interesting. Youssef, any views?
I'd like to be just a little bit of a wet blanket. I certainly hope that Gen Z will, you know, have an electoral awakening and shift the way that we engage with politics. But there are just a couple of things that always come to mind when I think about Gen Z. They're likely, at least in America, they are likely to be the first generation in America that does not earn as much as their parents did, right? You know, adjusting for inflation and all that. And that's a real psychological gut blow, right? You know, that really puts the lie to the whole, you know, American dream narrative. And I'm not quite sure how that's going to impact them. And then secondly, the thing that always comes to mind is, you know, there's this famous study of American politics and how people engage with American politics by Verba, Schlossman, and Brady, where they look at what are the sources, what are the resources that people have that allow them to kind of engage in politics? And obviously primarily is education and income. But if you, barring, those two things, right? If you don't quite have as much education and income as somebody, what do you turn to? Well, you turn to a lot of these associational memberships that you might have, primarily religion. And we know that Gen Z has been leaving religion in droves, and they haven't been coming back. Right, that lack of an associational space, I think we haven't really quite come to terms with what that's going to mean in terms of democratic engagement moving forward.
Yeah, interesting. Well, given we're in London, it's the USC London Alumni Club. We've got a question that is one I also wanted to ask the panel, which is, will Biden give the UK a kinder free trade deal? Brexit, I just lost it now. Here we go. Brexit has to hijack every conversation after all. So what do we think? The UK is floundering at the moment in terms of COVID, the economy, and desperate, I would say, to be loved by Robert Lighthizer and his team and get a deal done this side of the new year, and this side, ideally, of Inauguration Day. But where's that going to come from? Who's going to look more favorably upon the UK, in your opinions?
I don't know necessarily about the UK specifically, but I do know that Trump has been, as you guys all know, has been in some ways like bafflingly antagonistic towards America's oldest and most faithful allies. And that includes the UK, and it includes France, and it includes Germany, and has shown utter disregard and contempt for institutions like NATO, and so I don't presume to know what Biden would do in terms of a trade deal with the UK. I've not seen that. We're such a, unfortunately, blinkered country. I don't think that question has made its way into either of the two televised debates that we've had here in America. But I can't think that he would be any more antagonistic than Trump has been. But some of my colleagues may have other opinions on that.
Don't know if you have any points of view, Justin or Youssef, on this?
Certainly this is outside of my expertise in any way. But the only thing I'd say is, like, if you think about the recent party shift on the issue of free trade agreement, they've really flip-flopped, right? Where it used to be the Democrats were against these kind of deals and the Republicans were for it. And then we see with Trump, flip-flop on it. And then you see, the other former person running, Bernie Sanders, being kind of very against these kind of free trade agreements, right? So I don't know. It kind of depends, who's the voice of the Democratic Party if Biden wins, right? Is it coming from the left faction pushing his policy issues? I don't know. What does he think I think part of it is, what does he think plays best with white working class voters in the Midwest that he knows, he needs to, persuade, right? That they flip flop, right? But again, I don't have any predictive powers on that.
So we've got time for maybe just a couple more questions. Let me pick one up here from Eugene. To the panel, if the blue wave happens to take hold in the US, what's the likelihood of seeing policy or constitutional change on major policy issues such as the Electoral College, gun control, gun laws, immigration, etc., especially now with a conservative majority on the Supreme Court benches?
I guess it depends on how tall and big that blue wave is. I don't think, even if Democrats take control of the Senate, which seems to be slightly better than 50-50 odds now that they will do so, I'm not sure they're going to have a 60, in fact, I'm almost positive they're not going to have a 60-seat filibuster-proof majority. And so then the question becomes, and the Senate, of course, is about the most counter-majoritarian legislative body in any democracy on earth. And so then the question becomes, are Democrats willing to play hardball with the filibuster? And they could, of course, do away with the filibuster, which is certainly one option. It'd be interesting to see how apoplectic that makes Republicans in Congress, but nevertheless, that would be one option. And then, of course, you have a lot of things on the table then if that happens. You have the expansion of the Supreme Court, which if Democrats do that, they need to pick a different term than court packing to describe it, because I think that cuts their own argument off at the knees a little bit. But the expansion of the Supreme Court, you could have some real meaningful gun reform legislation. I'm not sure that the Electoral College will be touched, but perhaps you could get some immigration reform. And, you know, I think that it certainly is an enticing possibility. I think a lot of Democrats, particularly those on the left, have for a long time felt that the party is not as willing as Republicans are to play hardball and to truly exercise power, which, as Youssef mentioned, it's not always a healthy thing for the party in power to fully maximize what they're willing to do when they have the chance to do it. But nevertheless, I think a lot of Democrats are clamoring for that. And I think, too, it would actually improve Democrats' electoral chances in future elections if they're able to make some real policy reform. I'm not sure that your average kind of low information voter is really going to care that much about the loss of the filibuster if they're able to get some, you know, a COVID stimulus bill, or they're able to pass healthcare that has a public option or something else. I'm not sure that these procedural things that people who are, you know, in the ivory tower, like all of us, care about a lot. I'm not sure that the average voter cares that much about those things, but I could be wrong.
Youssef, tell us what you're thinking.
No, I'd like to just absolutely echo what Parker just mentioned there, and you know, this does indeed go back to Walter's question. I mean, these are if there is a Democratic majority in the Senate or 50, and we have a Democratic president, then the filibuster has to go. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. This is the main small d Democratic shift that has to be made in order to preserve American democracy, I would argue, moving forward. Now, there are some other things that a lot of people are advocating for, and I think reasonable people can disagree about that. But the more, you know, I've come to terms with the fact that I don't see a reasonable argument against getting rid of the filibuster if the Democrats have the power to do so. And to Parker's point, I mean, this is, you know, like, this will actually show people when you get to the polls, right? You can actually retroactively, you know, kind of look back and, you know, what did the Democrats do? If they didn't do a good job, vote them out. If they did a good job, you know, then you allow them to kind of stay on. But in the past, what we've done is, you know, we see that, you know, they didn't quite do a lot, but we weren't quite sure it was because of them or it was because of, you know, this super majority that we need in the most ridiculous way in our Senate, in our Senate. And so getting rid of that will actually make things a lot clearer, I would argue, for the electorate.
Yeah. Justin, were you going to add something?
I would. So, and I think, so the initial question I heard is like constitutional change, right? And like, if that entails like ratifying the Constitution and adding amendment, I think that it's pretty slim, right? That just doesn't tend to occur historically, and it's very hard to do. And it would require, like, if you talk about the size of the blue wave, it's also the trickle down of the blue wave to the state level, right? You'd have to flip governorships. You'd have to flip state legislatures that are part of the ratification process, right? But if the question is like, you know, radical change outside of the Constitution or how we interpret the Constitution, you know, I think, you know, what Parker and Youssef said, like, clearly the filibuster could change, like how we conceive of the size of the court could change without changing the Constitution, right? This is a census year, right? And so who wins the state level governments could alter how we district things, which will have a ripple effect moving forward in terms of gerrymandering, right? And so there's lots of, and just norms, right? That when we look at the, you know, our constitutional document, it's so vague on so many things, like the Electoral College, We don't actually have to get rid of the Electoral College, kind of echoing back what Dave said, if we just got rid of the winner-take-all portion of the Electoral College, right? And that could happen without ratifying the Constitution. You know, Parker, correct me if I'm wrong, right? But then the second thing is like all these norms that are a check on executive power, right? Those things aren't written into law, but we've seen in this presidency that norms really matter. And those things could change without altering the Constitution, which again is unlikely to happen.
Yeah. So I'm conscious of time. It looks like we've got one more question I've got time to ask you. And Alexandra wants to know, she says, this may be a very simple question, but what leads people to decide not to vote? I find it difficult to understand why someone wouldn't want to use their voice, especially in our current situation. Any views on why people don't vote?
Like I can speak to this just because that's something actually I was going to present on today and just didn't have time. Right. So the Washington Post just did, like, when you think about like another big book in political science is like Rosenstone and Hansen, right? And they talk about why people vote, and they basically break it down to because they can, because they want to, and because they've been asked, right? That's their kind of basic synthesis, right? And so when we think about like why people don't vote, you can think about how different groups in their position in society have different answers to those questions, right? Because they can, there's all sorts of ways in which voting is made more difficult for different populations. We've talked about voter suppression, voter registration, knowledge of the American political system, socioeconomic status, the list goes on, right? And that's not distributed equally across the population. Because they want to, there's psychological factors why people don't think that the government will change regardless of who's in office, right? Because they generally are not represented by American democracy due to, again, their structural position. I think that's less in today's climate than it used to be, right? But there's still reasons why some groups are like, we're never represented, right? And then because they've been asked, I was again looking at the data from Latino decisions in AAPI, and like Latinos and Asian Americans are just not mobilized at the same rate than white people are, right? They're not recruited at the same level. And until they are, they're not going to turn out at the same level, right? And so that's a missed opportunity of the political parties because there's so much growth in those populations.
Yeah. Yep. Well, we're pretty much now at the end. I'm going to put each of the three of you on the spot and ask you your prediction on the outcome of next Tuesday. So let's start with you, Justin. Biden or Trump?
I'm not a forecaster, no, but I'll say I think Biden wins, but I don't think it's going to be a landslide. I think he's going to win, and it really will come down to a handful of states again. Like if we look at the electoral map, there's so many states in play, and the margins are so small in those states. It could go anything from a landslide for Biden to a slim electoral college victory for Trump. And the actual polls don't change that much, right? But having said that, I think, Biden wins a, slim to moderate victory.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Youssef, what about you?
Conceptually, that makes sense to me. And I would probably lean towards concurring, but the problem is a slim victory for Biden opens up the door for contesting that slim victory, and I'm not sure what happens at that point. And so the actual tallies, yeah, I think it would probably be a slim victory. The actual outcome, that I can't say.
Right. Okay. And finally, Parker, what do you think?
Well, I've already told you guys about the inaccuracy of my crystal ball, so I should just get a coin from my pocket and flip it. No, but I think if I were to offer a prediction, I think I'm pretty confident that Biden is going to win, and I may be more confident than Youssef and Justin are in the scope of the size of his victory. But there are so many variables. We're in the middle of the pandemic. And we don't know how that's affecting people's decisions to vote, when they vote, You know, there's so many things, and it'll be very, you know, people are going to be studying voting behavior in this election forever, just because there's so many interesting sort of components to it. But I guess for now, I would offer up a prediction of a Biden victory. Great.
Well, can I thank each of you, Justin Berry, Youssef Chouhoud, Parker Hevron. We heard obviously also from Dave Bridge virtually, but hopefully that's given all of you some food for thought ahead of Tuesday as you watch intently on the 270 to Win website as well. Thanks very much from me before I hand over to Simon and James for letting me join you this evening and learn a lot about our system, which I didn't appreciate a lot of these nuances. So I appreciate all of you giving us some great wisdom and insights. So thank you from me, and it's been a pleasure being with you. Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will not take up much more of your time. We've been talking a lot about voter suppression and still there being huge amounts of turnout. I think I did my job by organizing this panel to finish at almost 10 p.m. on a weeknight. But despite my attempts to suppress turnout as much as humanly possible, it's been quite remarkable that we had, I think, 52 people at some point. I think last time I checked, 45 odd, and that's probably broadband and kids' bedtimes getting in the way. So I think that speaks to the power of the panel, the power of the speakers, and some excellent moderation that not only did we get so many people along, but they stuck with it until well into the night to hear about this topic and to hear the contributions of all the panelists. So thank you very much again to our panel, including Mr. Dave Bridge, wherever you are. We'll pour a little out for you and I will send you an email or something. Thank you too for the panelists who are here. You did a great job. And Allyson, thank you very much for a masterclass in moderation on Zoom. Both format and style, I think, top marks. And thank you very much for agreeing to do it for us.
Pleasure.
I'd also like to thank the team that made this possible. James and the London office did a huge amount. Shania, the intern from the office, did more work than probably James and I put together, and we're very grateful that she did so much. And finally, before I hand over to James, just a plea, please, to do keep in touch. If this is the first time you've joined a USC event, I hope it's the first of many. If at the very least, please sign up to our newsletter and do come along to some subsequent events. We've got a inside scoop on the USC admissions process. So if you know any aspiring teens who are looking at USC, get them along for that. If you're a USC alum, we're always very interested in admissions, aren't we? So do come along to that. But there'll be plenty of other events coming up, and maybe someday soon in person, I hope, as well. We're available on Facebook and LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and of course you can reach out to me. But let me just start by finish by where I started, by thanking the whole panel and by Allyson and saying thank you very much. And I will hand over to James to do the final bit of housekeeping and then to let you all go. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Simon and Allyson and Justin, Parker, Youssef, and of course Dave as well. What a really great event. And it's great to be there. It certainly opened up my eyes. There was a lot of blind spots I had about the US election, and I feel like I'll be watching it much better informed now on Tuesday. I'll put my email again in the chat if anyone wants to get in touch with the USC London office for any reason, or to have a chat, find out a bit more about what we do here. But this was an alumni event run by the Alumni Club of London. We're very fortunate to have a really active club in London, and I hope the students that tuned in from around Europe found it really useful, and hopefully it'll be the first of many events. Thanks so much, everyone. I'll end the call there, and do stay in touch. Bye, Dan.
Yeah, right on. Thank you so much, folks.